Again, lots and lots happening in global markets, global geopolitics, oil market fundamentals, the increasingly global effects of China's zero COVID policy, and of course, the escalating war in Ukraine. The oil price has been yo-yoing all over the place, below $100 earlier in the week, currently back above that level at around 104 this morning. So to go first to Robin Mills, please, Chief Executive Officer, KAMAR Energy of the UAE. Robin, tell me on fundamentals, what is going to determine oil prices for the next quarter? Demand destruction from slowing global economies, especially China, or supply destruction as more Russian output is taken off the market?
Yes, thank you, Frank, and good morning, everybody. You know, absolutely, as you say, yo-yoing, and it's been, you know, really, I suppose the volatility this year really remarkable, and that continues. I think it's interesting, you know, we're in a stage of such tense fundamentals on the supply side, and yet the market seems to be able to kind of look past that to an extent. You know, prices down a bit today, with the demand concerns. For me personally, still the supply situation is very important and concerning, and really in two ways. You know, the Russian side and the impact of that, and we're seeing as April goes on, you know, greater falls in Russian production, not as much as we might have expected, not as much as perhaps the IEA was saying initially when the crisis began, but still significant and growing. But then we have against that a backdrop of problematic supply in general, particularly on the OPEC side. You know, and I'm sure we'll talk about OPEC today, not just about OPEC kind of policy, but also about OPEC capability. But yet the market seems to be looking past that at the moment and really focusing very much on China. The demand destruction side, I think, we're still in the very early days of that in terms of seeing impacts. But what we are seeing, obviously, is the COVID lockdowns and the fears of much wider COVID lockdowns in China and much greater demand destruction there, you know, back to kind of 2020 style demand destruction from lockdowns. That seems to be really the big concern. I kind of see those things, however bad it gets in China, I still see that as ultimately transitory, whereas I see the supply side is harder to fix, but anyway, the market seems to feel a bit differently at the moment.
How much Russian oil are we going to lose, Robin? You know, we've seen conflicting figures recently, haven't we? It was less than 1 million last month, wasn't it? But then there have been forecasts of 3 million gone, and didn't OPEC suggest even 7 million, you know, longer term? Where will that land?
Yeah, I mean, the IEA came out quite early in the crisis and said, well, it could be 3.5, you know, but that was looking at kind of buyer reluctance and looking at all the companies that said they wouldn't buy Russian oil. But the IEA did say, well, okay, if some people say they won't buy, others will step in. You know, in April, as April goes on, starting to see, you know, up to 1 million barrels per day. Obviously, Russian production didn't turn off immediately. They filled storage. Storage is probably getting quite full now, and so they're getting to the stage when unsold barrels can't be produced. So I think we're getting to worse disruptions. Question is, you know, how quickly the Russians turn that around and start being able to access other markets if they can at all. I never quite got the 7 million. I'm like, well, what, did all Russian exports stop? Then you're in a kind of, you know, Iran-style secondary sanctions world where Russian oil becomes unsellable. That always seemed pretty far-fetched to me. You know, I'm sure that you know, we know there'll be markets of Russian oil in Asia in particular, even if Europe eventually gives up on it.
Rustin Edwards, head of fuel oil procurement, Euronav, over there in Switzerland. Rustin, what are you looking at when you decide on a trading strategy for the rest of the year? The fact that there won't be as much of the stuff around, or the fact that we won't want as much of it?
Well, I'm going to say I'm in a different camp than Robin. I mean, I think the demand destruction is already starting to impact the world markets. China COVID, yeah, I believe that is transitory as well. Once they get themselves in a more comfortable position, we'll see those markets open back up again. But you're already seeing it in the bunker space, where ship fuel demand was down 10% worldwide in February. And it looks like that demand is going to be even a further 10% in March, maybe 15, depending on what port you're looking at. You've got gasoline demand in the US. It looks like it's down 4.5 to 5% because of the persistent high gasoline prices are impacting consumer demand there. So it is starting to roll into the market. And when you consider that gas oil prices have been over $1,000 a ton for the better part of 6 weeks now, you do have that main base industrial fuel is becoming, harder to justify at the current economics that companies have based their budgets on. So, the demand destruction is starting, and it's going to start impacting. I think that's going to be impacting prices going forward far bigger than the supply constraints. Now, much to what Robin or what mentioned on the IEA on Russian crude coming offline, I think there's a bit of a misconception that you have the internal crude production of Russia and the internal crude demand for the refineries in Russia, and you have their export volumes. Now, yes, they're shutting in production internally for the inland refineries because the inland refineries rely on an export model that relies on pre-financing of Russian crude for Russian products on an export market. And since those lines of credits have been frozen, the internal Russian refineries are slowing down and shutting down because they're running out of places to put the finished products. And so they're not buying the internal crude. But I still think that means Russia still exports its 3.5–4 million barrels a day to the market. I think it finds other markets, and that could possibly be grown to 5.5 million barrels to the market if Russia gets into a crash crunch. So I don't think, the 7 million that OPEC's talking about, I think that's just fear mongering. And I think the IEA had it about right that it's about 1.5 internal, about 1.5 external that could be at risk if sanctions further hamper the ability of Russian investments in production going forward.
Jamie Ingram, Senior Editor, Middle East Economic Survey, over there just outside London. Of course, the Russians will still find buyers, won't they? China, India. Give me your view on that, how easy that switch will be. And also, if you would, what OPEC thinks about this, how OPEC will react to large-scale discounted sales from Russia to those countries.
Sure, thanks, Frank. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly as the other panelists have said, 7 million barrels a day mentioned by OPEC the other day with the EU. I think that's just trying to put the frighteners on the EU. Frankly, it's just saying it's part of the OPEC strategy of saying, look, if the worst comes to the worst, there's no way that we can step in and replace all of the Russian barrels. Therefore, well, why should we even try? Let's move away to a different strategy. I think it's definitely clear that Russian barrels, most of them anyway, will find another market. We're seeing them heavily discounted. Yeah, there's struggling to find buyers in some places, but the likes of China, they've shown, clear willingness to take in Iranian barrels under sanctions. They'll take Russian barrels as well. India recently, ministers have been pretty clear that they're willing to take discounted Russian barrels, and quite frankly, they're offended that Western governments would even try to suggest that they shouldn't do this. The Indian economy certainly could do with the shot of an influx of cheap barrels. That's interesting. I think that we'll see a bit of a market dislocation there with, if there's more Russian barrels coming into India, say, then well, what happens to the barrels that they currently take from big suppliers? Iraq and Saudi Arabia, they're the two largest players in the Indian market at the moment. Kind of speaking to producers there, they are concerned about the impact of an inflow of Russian barrels. That's clear. So they're trying to come up with strategies to defend their market share positions. We'll see how that goes. There is only so much capacity, after all, that India will be able to take. So then, what happens? Do Iraqi, Saudi barrels, for instance, get pushed out into other markets? Possibly. We've seen record Saudi volumes flowing into Korea recently. So you know what, you lose in one market, you can always win back in another market. Although obviously recession concerns if that leads to a significant global slowdown, then that might limit the upside there. When it comes to OPEC, on the second part of your question, they're showing no willingness at the moment to alter their strategy. As it stands, it's all speculation at the moment as to what the impacts on Russian production will be. So certainly until we see some concrete barrels coming off Russia, there's no incentive really for OPEC to increase the pace at which it's easing its cuts.
So they will stick with the OPEC Plus deal, for the rest of this year, or as long as it is applicable?
So if things go smoothly for them, then the cuts are meant to come off the table in September. That's when everybody gets back to their baselines. Certainly, they're meeting again on the 5th of May. I don't see any indication from anyone I've spoken to that they're going to change their strategy then. As I say, Possibly it becomes untenable later in the year, but certainly for now, status quo.
Robin, what do you think? Is there any way that they might be more flexible for the rest of this year, especially given the appeals that we've seen from the White House, from the EU?
I think OPEC's becoming less flexible, if anything, and made its position pretty clear. And as Jamie says, in the discussions with the EU as well, not just with the US. But look, I think OPEC's in a difficult structural position here, and we've been saying this for a while. That even if the Russian crisis hadn't intervened, the problem was, as the production limits increase, more and more countries can't hit their targets, and so more and more countries then resist any further production increase, which they're not going to benefit from. There's you could say the willingness of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have most of the remaining spare capacity to step in and fill any gaps, but that requires saying to everybody else, well, we're going to go it alone. Having put together this agreement with such difficulty in 2016 and kept it alive through 2020, there's a great reluctance to see it fall apart and to do favors to any countries which a lot of OPEC members don't feel deserve any favors. And you see, I think you've seen recently the discussions with the IEA as well. A lot of bad blood and discontent with the wider approach, never mind the Russia issue. And the Russia issue complicates it too, because Russia's in OPEC plus, and similarly, as Russian production goes down, of course, the Russians also have no incentive to agree to OPEC plus increasing its targets.
Right. Rustin, you have views on this. I know the OPEC plus deal extends to September and I think formally to the end of the year. But is there any way it can be renewed? The Saudis and OPEC generally talked about it being a much longer term strategic partnership, didn't they? But it ends in 22. Can it go on longer?
Well, I think what you see there is that, okay, they had the initial agreement to bring their exports up to pre-pandemic levels. So that's the initial part of the agreement. But I think the longer term coordination can be extended for as long as all the parties agree. I mean, it helps everybody else in the part of the OPEC plus agreement. It is benefiting them greatly that they're keeping prices well supported on having a more controlled, hands-on approach to the oil supply than what they've done in the past. I mean, back before the pandemic, you had the biannual meetings of OPEC, which, okay, you had a 6-month time frame, but now with this month-on-month type of announcement, I think that helps them better manage the supply situation. It helps manage the prices better because now they're not a 6-month time frame; it's a 1-month time frame.
I understand that in terms of, when Russia and Saudi Arabia were more or less at parity in terms of oil production. But by the end of this year, Russia could easily be an oil producing pariah. What's the point in having them in an alliance if they're hardly producing anything?
Well, it depends on what market you're looking at. I mean, if you got the EU not buying Russian oil, there's a lot of other countries that will buy Russian oil. And so Iran is still part of OPEC. And they supply oil to different people in the world, even though they're an oil producing pariah. Venezuela, same thing. They're still supplying oil to parts of the world that take their oil. So it's still part of the same pricing mechanism. And if Russia oil displaces Saudi oil into one market, then Saudi needs to find other markets to bring their oil into. Therefore, they can still control the world supply and demand balance of crude because that balance remains fairly static.
Okay. That's all about supply, isn't it? Let's look further at demand. There was a very good piece by Robin Harding in the Financial Times this morning, which I don't think made it onto the News Digest, entitled "The Rest of the World Should Watch What Is Happening in Shanghai." And I know that we talked about this briefly before. This piece talks about the escalating economic effects of the lockdown in China's biggest and most productive city. But he seems to suggest that there are severe global consequences of this and that there are much broader implications that could come from China's zero COVID policy. So I think we're reaching the stage of asking the question whether the zero COVID policy has failed and how is it now actively, or to what extent is it now actively hindering economic recovery? Jamie, let me get your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that if we're talking about whether zero COVID has failed, I think we're long past that point, really. Ever since Omicron burst onto the scene, it's been increasingly evident that, whatever governments do, they're not going to be able to stamp this out. So the idea of locking down huge cities like Shanghai, it's a bit perverse, frankly. I think that, there's huge economic damage, clearly not just to China, but also to the global economy in general. China is often seen as one of the key economic engines of the world. Lockdowns, it's very strange that they're continuing with this policy. Frankly, I thought months ago that China wouldn't react in this way, but yet here we are now. I think that if there are possible indications that China might come to the point of recognizing that maybe they need to adopt a more nuanced strategy to preserve their economy, I think that's something that would be welcomed by global oil markets, certainly the general commodities markets. But we'll see if that's something that's actually on the cards.
But there's no sign of that, is there, Robin? They seem to be sticking to the guns, and there are big domestic political events taking place in China later in the year. Do they just stick to this as a matter of ideological principle, or can they be flexible in any way, do you think?
Well, they haven't shown flexibility yet, and I think they're persisting this, as you say, until the party conference comes up later this year. They've put their credibility on this, and since early on in the pandemic, when they did manage to get the outbreak in Wuhan under control, this has been their playbook, and that was successful for a while. I absolutely agree with Jamie. I thought it would not last, that Omicron is just too contagious. It's just impossible to contain with these methods. And the economic damage and the social damage that goes along with that, as we see in Shanghai, is just intolerable. And I think this will just continue. But the leadership's in a very difficult place to reverse course. And also, of course, the relative success other countries have had in containing coronavirus and keeping deaths down has been because of vaccination. And we now see the Chinese vaccines are not very effective. So again, that requires another U-turn to say, well, we're going to use Moderna or whatever, some Western vaccine, or try and develop some Chinese knockoff, which so far hasn't worked. So there's another blow to the prestige of the leadership. So I think they will persist in this for quite a while, and perhaps in a few months there'll be other lockdowns that just become completely unsustainable. But I think that they're going to keep hitting their heads on this brick wall for a while.
Yeah. At what cost, I wonder? I think this is the first one of these shows that I've done for a while where Ukraine hasn't featured as a major element in the first half of the show, but that's not for want of its significance, because it seems as though positions are hardening again. We had some optimism last week when there were peace talks, but now positions seem to be hardening again. Biden yesterday called what the Russians are doing there a genocide. Putin has said no more talks with Zelensky. Meanwhile, we're waiting for a renewed offensive in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. Let me get a sense from the three of you, just a sense in the room of where this is going now. Please, Rustin.
Well, looking at it from a military perspective on what's going on with the Ukrainian assault, the war has not gone well for Russia. I think everybody can agree with that. The quick victory didn't happen, so now for political purposes, Putin needs to solidify the pre-invasion borders around the Donbass and Luhansk region, as well as Crimea, hope to create a land bridge between the two and call that a win, so that he gets the political victory back home. I think if that is his next end objective, to have his May 9th final date of victory be solidified, sanctions don't go away, and so you end up probably in a frozen conflict from that point going forward.
Jamie, the genocide issue, which President Biden took up again yesterday, I often think this is counterproductive. Really, my genocide is bigger than yours, but what's your sense on this? Will this exacerbate the problem? Will it escalate it further? Will it prevent Putin having the off-ramp that's been talked about so often?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I think I'll just reiterate what Rustin said there. 9th May is definitely the day that everybody needs to be circling on the calendars. This is when, Victory Day, victory over the Nazis in 1945. This is clearly when Putin wants to be able to claim some sort of victory for domestic consumption. Yeah, absolutely. That's why Western politicians have been so reticent to use words like genocide typically, because it does really limit the opportunities to come to some sort of negotiated settlement on this. I think we've crossed the Rubicon on that. There's no way back now. I think that the actions that have been very clearly documented, atrocities committed by Russian troops in Ukraine, makes it's impossible really for any return to anything close to pre-February 2022 political dynamics, regardless of whether there's a ceasefire or peace agreement in Ukraine. I think that when it comes to oil markets in particular, people, we often see sentiment over the conflict driving oil prices, but any idea that a peace deal will return Russian barrels being freely tradable in the West, I think is not feasible. I think that the reputational damage that would come from dealing with Kremlin-backed businesses, in particular oil and gas sector, it would frankly still be too damaging, even if we do have a peace deal in the near future.
So sanctions are forever, are they?
I wouldn't say forever, but it's certainly in the near term. I don't see it, even if there's a peace deal, I don't see any way around it. Possibly just as long as Putin's in power, then sanctions.
Yeah. Robin, you're a Russian expert. Sum it up briefly for me where we are.
Yeah, look, I think there's one more big military effort in the Russians, but there's also a big effort now, as we just heard from the US today, right, to rearm Ukraine to resist. And I think based on current performance, hard to see how the Russians will have a military success that's enough that they could kind of declare victory. So, I agree that this, we may enter a kind of phase of stalemate or, still prolonged conflict, but without the imminence that we've had in the past couple of months. And that means that sanctions will go on, more evidence of Russian war crimes, probably more war crimes will be committed and more attacks on cities and so on, as the Russians get further bogged down. So the sanctions persist for an extended period, and that means increased sanctions on oil. Europe will, if anything, will keep tightening its grip as it becomes less acceptable to take Russian crude, but also as alternative over the longer term, the alternatives get greater as well. If we do go into a phase of demand destruction, recession, whatever, of course, it gets worse for Russia because prices will drop, but also there'll be more supply on the market, more alternative supply, more opportunities for Europe to diversify. But then we have the whole long term. What happens to the Russian oil industry under heavy sanctions? When it lacks access to Schlumberger and Halliburton and so on, when it lacks investment, we will see, I think, a longer term diminishment of Russia's productive capability. Not kind of Venezuela style, but we will see a steady declines as the Russians can't go after the more challenging, technically challenging fields.
Let me just pull up the question because we spoke about this in the beginning. If we can pull up the question, please. What is the sentiment driving global oil markets at the moment? Single choice question, so just go for one or the other, please. Current oil market sentiment is being driven primarily by fears of demand destruction or concerns about supply constrictions. So if you could just vote for one of those, please. Robin, you mentioned this earlier, and I think it's an interesting subject, this spat between OPEC and the IEA, because at the last OPEC Plus meeting, we saw the IEA replaced as a secondary source on the grounds ostensibly of reliability. But a recent piece in Reuters this week claimed that this was all the Saudis actually, and that they had driven this decision because OPEC, Saudi Arabia in particular, saw the IEA as falling increasingly under the influence of Western environmentalists, and that therefore its data could no longer be relied upon sufficiently. Now, in some ways, this is a storm in a teacup, a very inside politics kind of story. But what do you guys think? You are the expert analysts. Is there any sense in which this claim that IEA has fallen under some kind of green influence, is there any way in which that is viable?
Well, look, I think the IEA, if anything, the IEA data actually improved recently because they made the long-term historic revisions on demand and increased their demand figures going back many years, and that corrected a lot of this kind of missing barrels problem that the IEA had. So, that idea that the data was wrong in some way, and therefore OPEC can't use it. If anything, that kind of rationale is weakened. Look, I do think there's been a problem with the IEA. This mixed messages. On the one hand, net zero, no new oil and gas developments, up until 2050. On the other hand, please give us oil right now. The market's short, and that has been a mixed messaging from the IEA, and that's been a mixed messaging from the US and so on as well. So I get that, and we've all been trying to get our heads around this for, ever since the net zero thing. Anyway, it is it's a very contradictory message. I can see that OPEC gets frustrated with it. That itself is not a good reason not to use the IEA's data, which is the IEA's best shot at understanding the oil market. And they get it wrong sometimes, as everybody does, but I don't think there's any systematic bias in the IEA data towards an environmental side or otherwise.
All right, Rustin, whose data do you trust? Whose data do you go to?
I generate a lot of my own data. No. I like to use a wide variety of data sources. It's mainly the IEA, the EIA. I like using the data that Platts and their associates happen, JBC. You got to take a wide view to get a real understanding of what the market's looking at. You just can't focus on one piece of data because then you can come into inherent bias. If you take a look at some of the data that comes out of banks and the bank analytics, sometimes the banks get it really wrong. Sometimes they get it right. It is a crapshoot. So it is, to me, you have to amalgamate the entire data picture and then come up with a view.
Right. Jamie, you are there in the UK, and we have a lot of British expat participants in this show. Just tell me how you see the future of the British government now. We had this development yesterday whereby the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, were both fined for breaking lockdown, for breaking their own lockdown regulations. How serious a thing is this in UK politics?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of headlines about, well, this is the last straw, Boris Johnson has to resign over this one. But how many times have we seen that played out in the past, and he's still there? He's certainly still trying to brazen it out. Him and Rishi Sunak showed, lots of contrition, of course. They're very sorry that they got caught at any rate. But they show no signs of planning to resign anytime soon. So far as well, other members of the cabinet, no one's really been willing to put the knife in at the moment. I think that, frankly, we've got local elections coming up in a couple of weeks' time in the UK. I think that what we've got to effectively, I think that the political party, the Conservatives, are in wait and see mode. If the results there are terrible, frankly, which they might well be, then the Conservatives have a very well-deserved reputation for being results orientated and changing their leader like that when needs be. So if the results there come in poorly for the Conservatives, then that might be what pushes the UK into looking for a new Prime Minister.
I'm no fan of Boris Johnson, but he does seem to have or at least been credited with having done fairly well over Ukraine, and maybe Tories will think now is not the time to ditch him in the middle of a global crisis there.
Yeah, and that's a fair comment. Certainly, he seems to have a decent relationship with Zelensky. But Boris Johnson loves to wax lyrical about Winston Churchill, who of course came in himself during a rather large conflict in the 40s, and then suffered an election loss just after, while the Second World War was still going on, after Germany surrendered, but the Japan conflict was still going on. So, Britain has a history of managing to pull off these political transitions, and France has their own elections at the moment. So,
yeah, of course, France is something we must look at. Can we see the survey result, please? Right, it's fairly evenly split. Supply, demand, I'm not quite sure what we can read into that, but on balance, people are more worried about getting enough of it rather than not wanting enough of it. Right, well, guys, I think that's all we have time for this week today. So thank you all very much indeed. Very interesting time, very interesting discussion. and see you all next week. Thank you, Jamie, Robin, Rustin. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Very much, Frank.
Thank you very much, guys. Have a good day.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.